older flutists complained that the flute had lost this ability to have the different sounds for the different notes. So one of the most important aspects of that is that it means that music in different keys have a different sound on the modern flute. If I play in G major, that sounds really different than if I play in A minor or F major or something like that. So, and that's something which the modern flute does not do, or it does it at such an infinitesimal level that it's hard to hear, whereas on the Baroque flute, that's part of the language of the instrument. So one of my first suggestions for people trying to think about their sound on the Baroque flute, on the modern flute, is to slow your air down. You don't need to blow with such fast air. You don't need to play so strongly. I think the sound that's produced when the air is going fast is more different from the way the sound is on the Baroque flute. So I'd like to play, I'm going to use up 3 minutes of my short thing here to play something I put together a couple of days ago, which is me playing the beginning of the Bach aria Aus Liebe from the St. Matthew Passion, first on the Baroque flute, then on a Louis Lott flute from 1879, and then on a modern Brannan flute. And what I was trying to do is to play the modern flutes, the instrument of the modern flute, the same way that I played the Baroque flute. And some of it, you can't make it the same, but other things I hope sound more the same. So I'll pull that up here. Okay, so when I first made that, I made it with only two flutes, only the Baroque flute and the Louis Lot flute, and I got a bunch of comments on it, which kind of focused on the sound of the Louis Lot flute, and I realized that that really wasn't representing the modern flute very well, and that's why I added the Brannan flute at the end as an example, really, of a completely modern flute. And the way those were recorded were all identical. There's no change in the balance, for instance. So the relative volume level that you heard is the actual comparison of the different volumes. So just a couple of practical suggestions to go along with that. Number one, there's a lot of flexibility to the airstream. In modern playing, people are taught to have a very continuous, sort of straight ahead, moving forward, get through the phrase kind of airstream. And in Baroque music, we're much more involved with playing smaller groups of notes and shaping individual elements. And there's wonderful examples from the 18th century that show this. I'm going to only show it for 5 seconds here. But this is Quantz's example of ornamentation. And these little markings, the W, the SR, and the S above notes are weak, very strong, and strong. Plus, you can see all of these hairpins. So even though we don't see dynamics normally written into Baroque music, and we don't see things telling us that certain notes are strong and certain notes are weak, they were by convention. And this Quantz example is a great way to see that. One final thing to avoid, I notice this even with my own students when I hear them play a Baroque piece on modern flute, is the tendency to play very loud when you're in the low register. That is completely the opposite of the way the Baroque flute works. And particular, certain notes like the G sharp in the first octave, there's no way to play that note loud on the Baroque flute. And so if you're playing Baroque music on the modern flute, it's nice to just soften that note a little bit in a similar way to the way it would feel on the Baroque flute. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Those are very practical tips that I think people can easily adapt to their instruments. And obviously directly connected to tone, the subject of tone, is articulation. So now I like to invite lovely Joanna Marsden to talk to us about aspects of articulation, which will help us in our interpretation of this earlier music.
Thank you, Teddie. So hi, I'm Joanna, and I'll be chatting with you today about the aspects of articulation in finding a Baroque sound on your modern flute, or Baroque if you like, but starting out. So during this talk, I'd like to highlight a few resources for you, which you can use after this session. So the first, which I thought might be really approachable, is Philippe Bernald's book, La Prononciation. So it's this one. And this one is it's a set of really useful tools for articulation with the goal of making your playing eloquent and expressive. So Bernald is one of my absolute favorite modern flautists, and I feel that he has a really novel approach to the instrument because he has had so much experience working with period instrument conductors like Franz Bruch and John Eliot Gardiner, Ton Kopman, and more. So in his book, La Prononciation, so this is not just a book of scales and a bunch of really useful practice patterns. He also includes this useful summary of articulation patterns from different periods on page 87 from historical sources. So from Quantz to Toulouse and to Tafanel. So it's just a really useful quick guide to get you started looking at historical sources. So it's a really useful place to start if this one's already on your music stand. So when thinking about articulation and Baroque style, I feel it's very important to start with the score. So later in this discussion, I'll compare two excerpts from Bach's B minor sonata, one from the Neue Bach Ausgabe, an Urtext edition, and one from Louis Fleury's edition for Durand from 1951. So Louis Fleury, for those who don't know, was a student of Taffanel's. So Urtext editions are an attempt by a publisher to reproduce the composer's intentions as clearly as possible without any additions or changes. So in the case of Bach's sonata in B minor, this is the only Bach flute sonata for which we have an autograph manuscript. And then we also have a few other copies of it. So there are like some discrepancies in these different texts, which the editors of the Neue Bach Ausgabe have tried to resolve for us. So they tried to save us some time by piecing together their editions to show us what they think that Bach may have had in mind when he was writing this piece. So there are a lot of different ways of engaging with music from the past. So I like to use either a facsimile or a manuscript or a very clean Urtext edition as a starting point so that I know that what I am adding as a performer. So it can also, on the other hand, be very fun to look at different ways that different people engaged with the past through time. Like some of these absolutely delicious 19th century transcriptions of Baroque and Renaissance music. So some of them like go to very strange places and it can be really fun to discover. So the original articulations in a manuscript or early print can tell us a lot about the kinds of instruments that people were using at the time and what they valued, what the performers from that particular time valued. So it can be really a useful articulation exercise to think about the addition that you're using. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But another general resource that I'd like to direct you to as a starting off point for period performance is like this nice English translation of Quantz's Versuch. It's called On Playing the Flute in English. So if you read French or German, it's available for free online on IMSLP. But this handy English edition was translated by Edward Riley. And it can give you a view of what Quantz, Frederick the Great's teacher, thought about music in around 1750, even though his tastes were really formed in the 1720s. So he has these kind of backwards looking aesthetics. But he has a lot of like quick and useful tips, which I'm going to give you. So one simple concept that Quantz talks about, which can quickly give you a sort of like leg up on period style, is the concept of good and bad beats. So what do I mean by that? So essentially, we accentuate or put more weight on our articulations in a common time measure on beats 1 and 3, and we lighten up on 2 and 4. So the way that Quantz recommends to do this is by using actually different accentuations, but also different syllables. So on modern flute, we typically use for single tonguing T, so tu 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 tu. For double tonguing, we use taka 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 ta, or sometimes dugu 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 dugu, depending on which language school you've learned in. But for Quantz, he recommends for single tonguing to alternate between T, D, and I'll get to another one in a moment. But T is a harder syllable and D is a softer syllable. So this can already give us a little bit wider palette to draw from. Quantz, throughout his book, also talks a lot about inégal playing. And so this is where the concept of paired articulations comes in. So inégal is just a fancy way of saying unequal timing. So Quantz recommends inégal pretty much in any style. So it can apply to German music as well as French music. So on the Baroque flute, it was very common to use paired articulations. For Hotteterre, he used turu, but for Quantz, he used tiri. So it's just a question of the language, what you find more comfortable. So already these syllables give a gentle inequality to the notes, both in accentuation and timing. So after this class, try playing a scale with the syllables tu, turu, 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 turu. And this simple trick already gives your scale a nice little lilt, because the notes, because of the paired syllables, lead to one another and are unequal in a very pleasant way. So Quantz, mainly for single tonguing, recommends the syllables ti, ri, and di. And for double tonguing, he uses diddle. So this one is a little bit tricky to get going if you're not used to it. But like any double tonguing, the trick with diddle is to keep a very steady airstream for shape and use the tongue just to define. So diddle works really well with very small movements of the tongue, just sort of bouncing around in the mouth. And it can be very, very straightforward for English speakers and German speakers, but a lot of my French students find it really hard. So we work on alternatives. So De Vienne and Toulouse, for example, they're both French speakers, and they recommend duge rather for double tonguing rather than diddle, because this is a much easier syllable for French speakers. You may love to know that taka is a historical articulation pattern from the Renaissance. So you can find Renaissance treatises that recommend taka 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 ta for double tonguing, as well as terelele. That one's hard for me to say as a syllable, but terelere. But it works. So I'd like to bring us back to the idea that I introduced about these editions. So I will share my screen now and show you this Bach sonatas example. So there we go. We're going to look at this. Let me go play. So do you see my screen well? Great. So here we have two very different editions of, sorry, that's my 10-minute warning. So I'll try to sum this up quickly. So in Louis Fleury's edition, I immediately noticed these slurs going from the pickup to across the bar line. So for Baroque specialists, this is a really different idea than we would expect. But I think actually for Louis Fleury's instrument, it makes a really beautiful effect. So this slur is not in the original manuscripts. It's something that he added. So it goes against the period idea of keeping leaps light and also good and bad beats. So slurring the pickup doesn't really make sense to me. He also extends this idea. So there's this Schleifer, this da-da-da-bum, this Schleifer ornament in the next, then the first full measure a couple times. So he slurs that to the next strong beat. And this has a really different effect for me than what I would expect in period performance. So for Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the Schleifer is a sorrowful ornament, which is used in highly expressive movements and is measured more by expression than strict time. So he notes that this ornament should really decay in volume, and you shouldn't try to like fill out the notes, but Louis Fleury seems to be trying to lead and press to the next thing with this slur going across the bar line. So this one I find really surprising. And I love, there's a couple like other little details that I love. I love this portato in measure 7 and 8. It's like a hooked bowing. And he also completely changes the hierarchy of the measure in measure 9, where there's a crescendo and a descending chromatic scale. So Bach here is making short little appoggiaturas, but Louis Fleury displaces the slurs. So it's a really interesting edition. It has nothing to do with period performance. So this is why I wanted to highlight it. It has I want to say that I don't think that Louis Fleury is doing anything wrong. This is his interpretation of the Bach sonatas, but this is not one that I would recommend if you're trying to form a Baroque interpretation based on what we know now about Baroque performing practice. Louis Fleury's edition is wonderful if you're trying to learn more about early 20th century style and how they thought about Baroque music. So I think as we are immersing ourselves in Baroque performing practice, it's very critical to just think about the kind of assumptions that these editors made and the instruments that they were using as they were constructing these interpretations, because they often have more to do about the performer's own artistic milieu than the recommendations from the period during which Bach wrote his flute sonata. Okay, I will pass it back to Teddie at this point. But
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you. We'll get to questions definitely toward the end of the session. So now we've touched on some aspects of flute technique, let's say. Let's see what are some other guidelines and additional concepts which can serve, which can help us in our interpretation. So may I invite the lovely Jessica Schury then to the mic, and she'll talk to us today about tempo and spirit, I think.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to dive into a little bit more about the reading and the expression behind the music, right? So I'm going to focus on the words that we all see at the beginnings of movements, right? Allegro, adagio, largo, right? And a lot of times we just kind of don't think too much about it, and we get right into learning the music. But it's really important to stop and understand those terms a little bit more. So a great majority of students, I think, are taught that those words only reference tempo. All right, and because I was interested when I was preparing for this, I went back into my beginner flute book that I learned from. I learned in band, so it was the Essential Elements book, and it quite literally says, allegro equals fast, moderato equals medium, and then it says andante equals a slower walking tempo. And I appreciate that they put more words for andante. That's helpful. And it's not to say that those definitions are wrong, but there is a lot more to those words than just fast. And now I even have students that are, oh, it's allegro. It has to be at least 120. Right, so it must be this metronome marking, because they all look, well, actually, I guess everyone has iPhone metronomes now, but a lot of the metronomes have ranges and tempos on the back, and while those are semi-accurate, an allegro doesn't always have to be at quarter note equals 120 and things like that. So I want to dig more into what these words also mean, which is the spirit of the work, the character or the mood, the affect of the work, which is very important when we're trying to play and bring out the character of the work, right? We want to take into account the affect, right? So if we're looking at this, there's two big things to take into account. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about key as well, and then I'll talk about tempo. So, right, so we've already mentioned that the differences between the modern flute and the Baroque flute, right? So our modern instruments use equal temperament. Okay, so every single note has the same quality and the same quality of sound. We can do that. When you play a G and an F natural, they sound the same. But on the Baroque flute, that is not the case at all. And so each key has a different sound and aesthetic to it. And composers knew that, and they wrote that with these things in mind. And often they chose their keys for very specific reasons, right? And so there's not one way to say like each key is one exact thing. So I do want to say that there are a lot of differences in these thoughts, but it can at least help to start thinking about these things when you approach a piece. So I'm going to share, I'm using the resource that you're going to be looking at is taken from this book, Performing Baroque Music by Mary Sir. It's a really great resource. It's a great resource where she summarizes a lot of other like original source material. It's just nice to have it in one place, but a lot of what she references is the Quantz book that Joanna showed. And so in her book, she makes this little chart of keys and what some of these other people thought, right? So you can kind of see, you know, they're not always the same throughout. That people didn't always have the same thoughts, but they were similar, okay? And it is a lot more than saying just a major key is happy and a minor key is sad. There's a lot more depth to it, and it can be really helpful to approach your music thinking of these things. Okay, and there's a whole chart. Again, it's a really great resource if you were to, you should definitely go out and get it. I know I don't know if it's currently in print, but I know that there are still some floating around when I did like a Google search about it, about the book, just to make sure it was still out there. So, right, so that's key. There's a lot more depth there, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go too deep there. All right, and so when we talk about tempo, right, so a lot of times these movement, like our labels, right, our tempo labels do have relative tempo ranges that go with them. Okay, and note that I said ranges. So when you see that an edition has a metronome marking to it, and you know that it is a Baroque work, keep in mind that the metronome was not invented until 1816. So they didn't put those numbers there. Someone else most likely did it later, and that's also why it's really important, you know, to do what Joanna did and reference like the earlier materials, reference text editions and all of that. It's really helpful to look at like what was originally there and what was added by editors. All right. So I often get students that come in that say that they play something, let's say it's Allegro and it says quarter note equals 120, and they have trouble playing it. Technically, it either sounds hurried or they're just struggling with it, right? And a lot of times they'll and I say, take it slower, but it says 120. Well, it also says Allegro, and Allegro means cheerful. Allegro does not mean it has to be, right? So I always like to tell, you know, students, and I think that all of us agree, right? The tempo should not dictate the character of the work. The character should dictate the tempo. Okay. And even Quantz in his book says, I'm going to quote a small quote from the same book, right? You've seen. And he says, notwithstanding all the liveliness required in the Allegro, you must never lose your composure. Your principal goal must always be the expression of the sentiment, not quick playing. All right. And that is the case with all tempos. If you're struggling with breathing and things. Oh, yeah. So sorry, I just saw Patricia's comment about metronomes. Yes. Yeah, they are much more accurate. Anyway, so I think it's very important to take into context the character, and I'm going to share Mary's summary of Quantz's. Actually, Quantz in his book also has, he categorizes tempos in 4 different ways. Okay, and so this is you can take this directly from the Quantz book. He just wrote it in paragraphs, right? So he has these different categories, this being the fastest and these being the slowest, right? And you could see that the pulse is changing, the pulse is a little bit different. And he speaks in terms of bow strokes, even though he was a flutist himself, but he does relate it to that. I think a lot of flutists relate playing with bow strokes, which is really helpful. So you could see kind of what he wrote, right? So like these categories, while each of these words does have their own meanings, he gives how he thinks they should be approached, which can be really helpful. And he goes into dances as well. So I'm not going to go much into them, but each of the Baroque dances and their characteristics, they're all there, and you can kind of see what a whole bunch of different composers thought about them. All right, so again, just a reference. I wish I could, we could talk forever about all of these topics that we're each talking about. There's a lot of depth here, but this is just the surface. Recommended resources, right? Mary Sir and Quantz. All right, so I'm going to hand it back to Teddie.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I love that point about not expressing a tempo, but expressing, a character or some emotion. I find that also, especially with my young students, that's always a kind of for them hard to grasp. Okay, great. Let me just share my screen here. Oh. Can everyone see this all right? Just 1 second. I need to get this. There you go. All right. Okay. So I like to use imagery when talking about music, and I just thought it would be interesting for people to look at some visual examples from the Baroque times and see how we can draw similar relationships to music. So I was very struck by this statue. This is in the Palace Gardens of Versailles. And first of all, this individual flower kind of caught my attention because I just felt like it was so wonderfully carved. But you see that in fact it's only one of many flowers in this garland, and the garland is also actually just one compositional element in the entire statue. Same thing with this pavilion here, also in Versailles. I hope you can see that this structure has many, many fine details. And if we look closer, we'd see how, for example, that these small leaves kind of make up one shape, and then a couple of these shapes support these scrolls, and a couple of these scrolls then connect the dome together with one column, and many columns then support the entire dome altogether. And also notice that there's hardly any flat or blank surface. There's always something going on, and that's very typical of the Baroque style. So we can deduce from these analogies that everything has its place and meaning, whether big or small. So every single detail has their specific importance within an overall context. And translating that into music, we as players or performers can gain much insight into a piece of music by really scanning the fine details of a composition. And I want to mention now a couple of aspects in music where you might want to search for these fun details, which can then really enhance your understanding and interpretation of the piece. So one thing I like to suggest is looking at intervals. So how do the notes move? And I have this favorite quote from Johann Mattheson, where he talks about how large intervals expressing the expansion of the soul and small intervals showing a kind of contraction. So take note of special intervals, like when they're large, maybe in an octave, for example, or if they're augmented or diminished, or very small intervals such as like a half step. And these instances can be great sources of expression. One example would be here is the end of the first part of Telemann's B minor fantasy. The ending of this first part is very exciting, okay? And the line, if you just see this last phrase or segment, if you would, they basically just look like a string of 16th notes at first, right? But actually, we can use articulation to delineate little shapes that are embedded in the line. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to really go into this, but as Joanna had mentioned, and also for basic advice for anyone starting out, is simply try to use a varied articulation, varied tonguing, such as t, d, or r. This is a hard R, like in Spanish. And imagine you're like carving and sculpting the sound with your tongue. Now, these shapes need to have continuity with each other. So this is shown by the kind of larger blue brackets. They need to connect somehow. The shapes aren't random, obviously. So again, think about how little elements contribute to make up the big picture. And this continuity can be achieved with dynamics, for example, or how you direct the air, how you manage the air. So I just like to show that as an example, this passage could sound something like this. You might want to pick up your flute now and maybe just play it through as I talk along. And I invite you to try this further on your own. Compare shaping with articulation and then playing it straight. Like if you would play notes all equal and not try to sculpt with your sound. And play these two versions back to back. And in this case, it's really exciting to hear the progression of intensity from small intervals to big ones. So the point here is find the fun and expression in intervals in your articulation. Another idea I want to suggest today is not being afraid of irregularities. Now let's go back to the original meaning of the word Baroque, which has French and Portuguese roots, referring to an imperfect pearl. So although symmetry was important, the art trend back then also liked to celebrate a sense of bizarreness, if you would. And we can kind of feel that from this highly ornate and bizarre chalice from the treasures in Dresden. And it's the same in music. So for example, towards the end here, this is J.S. Bach's Bourrée from his Partita in A minor. I would recommend separating this E here from the rest of E16th and make it as a pickup to the next bar. And this may sound kind of odd and abrupt at first, but it's actually more reflective of the harmony. And by not playing it like how it looks on the page, so by not following how the notes are barred, you're actually showing Bach's humor and also enhancing the character of a bourrée. So I'm going to play my audio example here. We're going to start at the last kind of pick up to the theme again. Yeah, and so these are only very, very few musical examples I can show today in our short session. There are obviously countless instances with these kind of irregularities or things that don't seem immediately clear on the page. So go ahead, explore and celebrate those irregular moments, and that's what makes music fun and special. So definitely go beyond how the notation looks on the page, and with even just a bit of knowledge in harmony and theory, that will really help you get that much deeper into the music. I was so afraid of running over time, but I also want to get to people's questions, so that's actually all I have to say for today. How are we doing on time? Okay, we've got 10 minutes.
Teddie, could I interject one thing that I didn't get time for that I think is super important?
Oh yeah, sure, definitely,
Okay.
please.
Just the dreaded question of vibrato. I think we would all agree that in standard modern flute playing, vibrato is part of tone production. And since tone was my topic, I would just say that it is not part of tone production in the Baroque flute or the classical era flute as well. They did have doing vibrato, but vibrato was only done on individual notes. And a vibrato had a beginning to it and had an end to it. So you need, a half note or a whole note or something like that to do a vibrato. And for most of the Baroque period, they did the vibrato with their finger, not their air. Now, oftentimes, if you ask someone to play without vibrato, I think this is seen most clearly with string players. If you ask a string player to play something that they just played, you say, okay, play that again without vibrato. What happens is they play it, and it has absolutely nothing other than the notes. It's like it has no musical concept to it at all, because so much of the musical concept comes from the left hand in the modern violin, whereas in the Baroque period, the expression came from the bow. And that's very much, for us, that's the wind and the articulation. So instead of using vibrato all the time, we are constantly changing the way that a note works. So I tell my students sometimes, if you feel like making vibrato someplace, you should be thinking about what else you could do there other than vibrato, which is almost always make a shape. And when the note has a shape, you kind of lose this temptation to always have vibrato running on. And I think because we, as flutists, need to learn to use articulation and air and shaping and silences and all of these things, it's good to just completely say you're not going to use any vibrato. I think some people try to play Baroque music using the subtractive method, meaning, okay, I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to do that. That's not a good way to do it. You want to, start from the bare bones and then build your interpretation of the piece, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to play it, but I'm going to not use any vibrato, and that will make it sound Baroque. It'll help, make it sound more clear, but you need to do lots of other things. But it's easier to do those other things if you're not using a constant tone-based vibrato.
Thank you. That's a great addition. Okay, so we've got 6 minutes. I would like to open up the floor now for any questions. We don't want to leave your questions unanswered. So either feel free to jump in on the mic or pop in the chat. And maybe then in the meanwhile, I'm curious about my fellow colleagues here. I have a question for all of you, which is what's in it for you to be involved in historical performance, whether it's the performance practice or playing on historical instruments. What's in it for you? And I'll start by saying that for me, and this kind of ties in with what Michael was just saying, that for me it actually opens up options, and I don't feel like it's not about you cannot do this or you cannot do that. It's not limiting, but actually for example, looking at the details and understanding details in the music opens up a lot of options for expression, and I find it really a fun thing to do, and it makes music interpretation and music playing just a lot more fun and exciting. So that's my thing with historical performance. Anybody else would like to share?
I think that I really enjoy the variety. The flute changed so much from the Renaissance period to the 20th century, 21st century, between 20th century and 21st century, a bit less of a progression, just in terms of like the amount of change that happened to the instrument. But really, it's exciting and engaging to figure out how all of these different instruments work and what they want to do. So it's always useful to be able to start from like, what does this instrument want to do, and what does it want, like, what is it great at, and what is this very, very different instrument fantastic at, and what can I do with that? So
I think
I find it very freeing.
Yes, also national differences.
Oh, absolutely.
Flutes from different countries, sound different.
Big soft spot for French flutes, but German flutes behave very, very differently.
Michael, you want to say something?
I was just going to say that one of the things that I realized when I started playing Baroque flute was how much we learn from the instrument itself. And that's one of the reasons why I tell people who want to study the Baroque flute, you have to have a decent Baroque flute to start with. You can't buy a flute that, is really a folk flute or some other kind of instrument. That is not going to teach you how to play the Baroque flute. And a really good Baroque flute will teach you amazingly, because you'll realize what that flute can do well, and you learn to take advantage of those things. And that's how you become a good player of the Baroque flute, is to be able to intuitively connect with your instrument and be able to make it do whatever is in your imagination, basically.
I would like to make a comment. I don't know if you can hear me.
Hey,
This
Mark.
is Mark talking. Yeah, I
We can-
can't get my face on there. Doesn't matter. It was interesting. I mean, one of the most important things out of the Baroque is to understand messa di voce, which came from the voice, and that's a shaping of phrases, shaping of the voice. And flutists often referred to what the singers were doing or what the violins do with their instrument. The other comment is Michael Lynn was talking about vibrato. In studying with René Leroy, who's one of my teachers, he told me, he said, there is no vibrato, there's only expression. And that's a modern player.
Yes, René Leroy is an incredibly inspiring teacher, and you were so lucky to have that experience. I think that a lot of the French school, it also goes with Bernold, who I brought up earlier. He has all of this period instrument performing experience, but also his use of vibrato is really scaled back from what I hear in other national schools. And it has a lot of commonality with the way that Monsieur Leroy played, I feel. So there's a lot of this idea of that we don't need to use a constant vibrato everywhere. And I find it very refreshing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Joanna. We are exactly on the hour. Are there any last questions or concerns? Can we clarify anything further? Well, you can always reach out to us afterwards individually. And in this case, then I just want to say thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to the NFA.
Yes.
Thanks, Tanner, for facilitating this session. We hope that we've shed some light on how you can play earlier music in a way that's more stylish, also effortless, and hopefully also in a more fun and engaging way. And lastly, I'd like to draw your attention to the Historical Flutes Committee webpage on the NFA site. There has been a tremendous overhaul recently, and thank you, Tanner. So we've included things like a Baroque flute fingering chart. There are educational videos and also information about the Betty Bang Mather Baroque Flute Lending Program. So if you have any questions about historical flute playing, feel free to contact any one of us. And of course, we look forward to seeing you all at the convention in Atlanta this year. So thank you very much and have a good rest of the Sunday. Yes, I'll hand it back to Tara now.
Thank you to the Historical Flute Committee, and thanks to everyone who attended today's online event. A recording of this event is going to be published on the NFA YouTube channel later this week. Our next online event is going to be, I believe, 1 week from today on Sunday, January 26th. Brandon LePage is going to be giving a talk entitled Mapping Moise, a Treasure Hunt, and that'll be at, again, 2 p.m. Central Time on Sunday, January 26th. To learn more about us, please visit the website at nfaonline.org, where you can easily go over to the Historical Flute Committee page through the Committees tab at the top. And also follow us at NFA Flute is our handle on basically all the social media platforms. So thanks again, and we will see you next week.